Thanks everyone for coming out today. I'm Glenn Rubenstein with Adopter Media. Today we're going to talk about Podcasts Without Borders, the next wave of global audience growth. And before we get started, I want to give a special shout out to Elsie Kaplan on our team who put this panel together and was not able to attend today due to some travel issues. But what you're going to hear today, it's actually funny. Adopter Media, our company, is 10 years old. And what you're going to hear today is very interesting because a lot of the themes and a lot of what's being said is actually going to sound like a United States podcast industry panel from 2016. But with that, it's actually an amazing opportunity. So I'm very, very excited to get into this and talk about the maturity specifically of the UK market for podcasts. So if we could start, Rebecca, with you introducing yourself.
Yes, hello everybody. It's lovely to be here. So I'm Rebecca and I lead influencers, affiliates and strategic partnerships for HeliosX, which is a group that looks after online pharmaceutical companies here. So we have MedExpress, Dramatica, RocketRx, Zip Health. And yeah, excited to chat today about the UK podcasting industry.
And I'm Craig Eastwood. I'm leading the international expansion of Audioboom, the podcast network.
Great. So Craig, if you could start actually and set the scene for us, because the US is close to accounting for less than half of the global podcast market. You've obviously been working the UK market for quite some time. From Audioboom's seat, how big is the UK podcast market today for advertising and how fast is it growing?
So it's growing very quickly. It's roughly around 15% of our revenue as a company. But we are massive in the US. But it is growing quickly. I think they're expecting it to be double-digit growth this year, which is ahead of most digital channels.
And Rebecca, what made HeliosX and MedExpress look at podcasts? Were you taking cues from what US companies like Hims and Hers were doing, or talk to me a little bit about how you spotted the opportunity?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's probably a tale as old as time, if people know here, but it was reaching a saturation point, especially when you're doing online pharmaceuticals. I'm sure people know of the boom of like GLP-1, sexual health, hair loss, prescription skincare. And very much we were looking at, okay, we've reached a market maturity and we have mainly relied, let's say, on like cord paid channels. So what's that like next bet? What's like the next thing that we would do? So especially with MedExpress, which is kind of like our flagship brand in the UK, we wanted to start to look at like different opportunities, and you could start to scope up, I guess, to more brand channels or different types of mass media. But we really wanted to look at podcasts because we saw a huge opportunity with the fact that it was like low competition between our competitors and also like the increase in podcast relevance. Like it's high resonance, in between time for advertising. And it just seemed like the most performance-led way to kind of scope into consideration audiences for us.
And Craig, talk a little bit about what the opportunity is, because obviously, you know, UK podcasts when they started, and especially with like the BBC, didn't even have host-read ads. Some of the, as we were talking about before, like Joe Rogan is huge in the UK, but obviously Joe Rogan is not really doing host-read ads for UK brands. So what are the opportunities in this market for host reads compared to programmatic ad insertion on existing imports?
Every UK podcast does host reads pretty much. So pretty much everything that you want to do is available. I think there's a lot of branded segments and features in branded podcasts, even more so I would say here than in the US. So that in-depth message is available. I would say that the majority of people who spend any time buying podcasts do look at host reads as a first option. And then the programmatic and direct spot comes after that.
And Rebecca, when you were evaluating the opportunity, and now that you've given that we've done this a while, and just so you know, MedExpress is an adopter client, are you seeing it more as a branding play, a performance play, or both?
So we do see it predominantly as like a performance play to begin with. That was kind of the idea for us. We wanted to pick basically a medium where we could start to understand, okay, what is that middle audience? Like who is considering, how can we reach them on long form? How can we segment by that, but do it in a way that is a little bit more controllable than say if we're just gonna go like balls to the wall with like brand advertising to begin with, which has such like a long time, like 12 months for us to understand. It gave us that like in the middle, and we definitely there is like a secondary, maybe we call it brandformance, which is like, like a kind of in the middle, but I would say that brand is like secondary to us to performance. And that's like a key reason, I think, also with being with Adopter, that was like really enticing to us, is that you have that brand first lens.
And it's interesting, I think something that I have to credit Mac journalist Jason Snell with pointing this out maybe 10 years ago, is that when you think about podcast ads and people say, oh, it's all DR, it's all direct performance, where's the brand awareness, where's the brand building? In the US, if you look at brands like Blue Apron, like Squarespace, like Casper Mattress, Manscaped, even Athletic Greens, these are brands that actually built their brand through direct response ads at scale. So it's really the best of both worlds, that you're actually getting performance tracking. And what we've seen with like our partners at Podscribe and IP matching. So you're getting that performance tracking, but then you're getting that cumulative brand halo that builds. And I mean, Craig, like there's not nearly as much competition in the US in terms of ad loads. I mean, in the US, I mean, it's gotten a little out of hand. There are some shows on a 2-hour-long podcast where you'll hear 16 ads. And I'm probably rounding that down a little bit. But how does that compare with the ad loads that you're seeing here?
So I think some of the biggest podcasts here probably compete with that. Some of the most respected and high demand in terms of advertisers can easily get up to that.
Yeah.
I think one thing to know is that it's probably a direct flip, whereas if you have the stats, but it's mostly direct response brand advertising in the US. It's 90% branded here. There's very little direct response. So that is one thing as well, going back to the previous question, that I think UK advertisers could learn from, is to use it more as a performance marketing tool rather than just having their brand message out there.
Yeah, and Rebecca, talk a little bit about that with attribution, what you've been doing with pixel tracking versus your additional, mixed model methodology.
Yeah, so it's like quite an interesting way for us of I guess like blending like what we're saying here. So we're able to kind of like bring in the IP in the UK and basically use like the pixel tracking based on that like audience like listen, audience download. It gives us like within the attribution window something that we've built in-house with our MMM to understand, okay, not to compete with the other channels, but if we're looking at it where the influence lies of a podcast and how long, which we have like internally, to make it like fit within like our actual positional model. So like, what is the conversion? How does it actually mean something? And then as you say, then that scopes back up to like a halo effect. So it's a bit of a duality channel for us. It's not such a, like if we think about something like traditional PPC, which is just like so demand led, this does kind of like a really nice relationship for us, because yes, we can track it in that performance way. Yes, we built it in our attribution model, but also then we like feed back into our system that's like, okay, but these are the areas of net new audiences. These are the areas of net new scale, which is quicker than trying to do something, I think, a bit more just like awareness only.
And where do you see podcasting sitting in that mix in terms of multi-touch points? Do you see it more reinforcement? You're getting net new introductions to audiences, or how is that shaking out?
Yeah, so we see it kind of sitting within more of, I would say, like a hybrid between the mid to the, I guess, because we look at it more like mid is that, but it does touch everything. But where we see it play is it's definitely like that, almost, if we could call it like the equivalent of like a first click or a first like instance and a first introduction. But what we've actually seen within, so healthcare is like a really long like journey to buy. Like you're not going to buy like skincare product instantaneously when it's prescription, or weight management when it's prescription. So we can actually see within that like dynamic funnel of like, yes, it hits them here, then they come back and like maybe like listen or download like a different episode from like the similar show that we've like brought programmatically on, hear it again, and then come back again. And we track that all through basically like direct specific like URLs or codes, and then also look at it in terms of like a lift on a post-order survey. So we really see podcasts actually playing at every level of the funnel. And depending on where you're buying or what the ad read is, or say if we're doing like that programmatic spend versus host spend, that's where we see the play. So I think the channel is something that's actually really exciting in the UK. specifically because there's not that many people doing it in this way, but also to filter through all of your marketing KPIs, if we want to call it that.
And Craig, obviously there's huge programmatic opportunities, both in terms of what Audio Boom does, networks like Acast, but when it comes to the host-read ads, is there an education gap still that you found, or do most podcast hosts of net native UK content really understand the terminology, baked in, dynamic, mid-roll, faked in?
I think they understand it as much as they need to. They don't know more than that. I think one difference between the UK and the US hosts, and especially those who start up their podcasts and that's their main thing, they are happy to read ads. They're quite open to what brands they talk about. In the UK, it's becoming more and more new podcasts are all established celebrities, and they have brands, personal brands that they protect. So they become very specific about what they're going to talk about. So I'd say that more than anything else is where there's maybe a bit of a fall down.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the US, one thing we point out to clients a lot is that there's a lot of celebrities with fairly high name recognition that brands would be shocked at how low the barrier cost to entry is for advertising on their podcast. I always describe it that like Mandy Moore will charge you a six-figure sum for an Instagram post, but you could sponsor her This Was Us Rewatch podcast and have her do your ad for a little over $1,000, which is insane to me. But it's interesting that it's more there's more protection here. So Rebecca, what challenges have you found that you've really faced so far?
I would say like the challenges is quite like an interesting thing, because it's a little bit to your point there of what are people willing to actually endorse and how are they willing to do it. So we've actually found like programmatic has been quite easy for us in a way, but doing host reads and kind of having that like full picture of what you would want to be able to like actually run at scale, but also like target, resonate, and test has been very difficult, because definitely hosts, I would say, like protect their brand. They only have certain things they want to do. Obviously, like as you guys know, like I've just said, we're in a space that's like a little bit maybe a lot more consideration for a host. So I would say that's one thing. And also probably I would say within the UK, there's a lot more of a cultural tone to like an ad, or like how people perceive an ad. Whereas like sometimes when we've done this in the US, like it can run on so many things. So that is a little bit of a challenge. And probably also combined with just like the size of the UK and the penetration of like UK listeners who can actually like buy UK product. There is a little bit of like a ceiling with that. So how do you work out impression versus frequency versus the relevant, and finding new audience at scale within a very small particular country maybe?
It's interesting. I mean, Craig, when you look back at the origin point of podcasts, I think, the BBC, Ricky Gervais obviously play a huge instrumental role in establishing the format and the medium. But as we've discussed, like with advertising, that's really been a US-led effort. Like, do you have brands that are coming to you to do more unique integrations? Like, do you think there's an opportunity to innovate for the UK market and do things a little differently with host ads that might resonate more?
Yeah, I think we've gone through standard host read 60-second ads quite quickly in comparison to the US. So obviously those have been around for years. In the UK, I think almost as many ads now are 3 or 4 minutes extended reads with content in them as well. I think that's definitely the way it's going more and more, and those more rounded sponsored campaigns rather than just the quick sales message.
And do you think brands, in your experience, do they understand that? I mean, it's interesting, Rebecca, I know we have like kind of tightly crafted talking points. I know with telemedicine, there's a little more regulation there. But Craig, like, Tim Dillon, who's on Audio Boom, is a great example. He's a very irreverent comedian, does a lot of political and social commentary. And we've had him do ads for our clients that are 45 minutes in length, where he goes off on diatribes and stories and questionable taste and appropriateness aside, but he brings it back around to the product. And we've seen, well, back when he was newer and less expensive, we would see like 10x, 20x return on direct response. Do you find that brands, in your experience, are willing to give creators that latitude in the UK, or it's still very much like stick to the script?
I think it varies. There are some where it is word for word. They want it read that way, and it's not just legal T's and C's that have to be that. I think those that find the best ROI do let the host talk how they naturally talk to their audience. Speaking to someone earlier, they have a ROI of 10 times 10 times spend, and that comes from literally they run these segments that are maybe 4 minutes long, just talking about, gives it away, but what they're watching on TV, and then it's just a message at the start and the end, and that's it, and they don't need any more sales messaging than that.
And Rebecca, have you given thought to sort of additional strategies or ways to try and change it up a little bit? I know we've done a ton of programmatic stuff with more minimal on the host side, but what really excites you about the possibilities of innovating?
Yeah, I think that, so what we're hoping to do is kind of almost bring in like what we've been talking about here is a little bit more of like that dynamic partnership angle. So obviously like we work outside of this with like talent, with influencers, like in a 360 type way. So moving into more of that simulcast, like moving into more of that sponsorship opportunity over time and evaluating it in a way that's not just like we harness the programmatic for, the scale, but I think like we move into kind of like building bigger campaigns with talent, but building in a way like we would build like a talent-based campaign, and then coupling this with different types of like testing. So like lift testing, geo testing, also like targeted like ad read segmentation. Like we have quite like a big, like pool of like experimentation of where we want to go, because we're very excited about podcasts. And I think that, you just have to try it. You have to try new things.
Well, one thing that I love to know from brands is that I think every brand has a set idea. We were talking earlier about a client that we'd worked with that thought their audience was premenopausal women because it was a sleep cooling product. And we put them on professional wrestling podcasts where it's a lot of guys that look like me and have undiagnosed sleep apnea. And it crushed the return on ad spend on a huge level to where the brand like didn't even know that was a potential audience for them. I mean, so has there been anything that's really surprised you or evolved your view of who your target customer is?
Yeah, it's been really interesting because we kind of like entered podcasts, especially like when we were starting like out with Adopter, basically trying to be quite generic about what we did. So there's obviously internally a lot of like personas, there's a lot of messaging, there's a lot of things that are driven and known. And we decided to go quite general with ad reads. And what we found actually is like, especially say like an underserved segment for us is like men. And we were speaking to men about sexual performance, sexual health, obviously like one of the main key segments for us in that treatment type. And what we found is actually like predominantly the men that were coming were actually buying weight loss medication. So there's a lot that I think we don't know. And I think that podcast is that sweet spot between like the resonance, authenticity, but also being able to do something a little bit more, programmatic and at scale where we can learn about that. So I would say us for 2026 is trying to not overthink and trying to let like basically the audience tell us, but in a way that's like data significance, which you don't get that often.
Well, and that's one thing I love about Podscribe. So for those that don't know, Podscribe captures the IP of the listener of the podcast, and then you put a script on the brand website and you're able to do some direct IP matching. Now in the US, we're able to run against Experian, TransUnion, other consumer databases. And one thing that I find hugely insightful for brands is that we all know the stats the networks say you're going to reach with the targeting and with the shows. But one thing I love to look at is the actual performance and see who actually heard this based on the demos, who actually visited the most, who actually converted the most, and how can we intake that information to do stronger buys in the future. So yeah, sometimes you don't know where you're going to end up. You have an idea, but the destination can be different. Craig, what do you think is something that brands are missing out on right now that they should be doing more in the UK?
So what you're touching on there, measurement, is massively underplayed here. All the same tools are available, GDPR compliant, but brands don't take up the offers here so much. You guys obviously do it incredibly well. Lots of US buyers do it really well. And that's why I'd encourage people to look at more, because as you say, you test different genres, different messaging, you will see what works. And then, you increase spend because it is doing so well. And I think that's definitely what UK buyers could be doing a bit better.
And Rebecca, what's one thing that you would advise brands on that are considering jumping into this space?
I think I would say like go in more with like that fail fast, test fast kind of like mentality, is in like don't come in almost like, as you say, within the measurement, is in let the podcast kind of like lead you where you need to go, and don't be so specific as in like I only want to get like these 5 hosts that are top X in the UK because they speak to segments Y. Instead do like widespread scope and kind of like throw the real book out, because I think that's like the best way for you to actually unlearn what you think you know about your brand.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think this is really a medium of discovery for brands, because you do have you have more of a direct channel to the audience. You're tapping in to the host relationship with the audience. Even on programmatic audio, I mean, you're getting someone that's very on demand, engaged. This is a lean forward medium, and I think that the results show that. So I think you both. One thing I want to close with here for everyone, seriously, when you think about where we're at in the UK with the growth of the market and the tripling or quadrupling over the last 5 years of podcast advertising, what's astounding to me is like we have all this data from the US. We have the case studies, we have the methodologies, we've battle tested the ad formats, the way to do copy, the way to do IP tracking and audience attribution. And I've been working in tech since I was 14 years old. I just turned 50. And I think back to the 90s a lot, and think back to when you could get any .com you ever wanted because it was available. I think back to the early days of the internet. You could build any website you ever wanted. And I think with the UK ad market, given the growth to the relative size of the population and listing base that we're seeing right now, like this is one of those opportunities where you say, oh, if I could go back. Well, the good news is you have that 2016 opportunity that we had in the US. I think you have that now in the UK to be one of the first brands to really go big, dominate, build your brand, and just stake your claim. So, I definitely advise you all to seriously consider it as you look at new marketing initiatives for 2026. Yeah. And with that, we're done.